Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Peter, and thank you all for coming. I've spoken rather a lot about socialism over the past 2 years or so, but never actually in a country that has experienced the real thing. So some of you will know a lot more about this just from experience than I do, and I'm looking forward to see what you make of it. If somebody had told me 5 or 6 years ago that I would be writing this book, I guess I wouldn't have believed it. I would have thought, why? Why write about socialism? Socialism is kind of dead. It's a topic of the past. Surely 3 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the Velvet Revolution here, surely we've sort of learned our lesson here. But no, it turns out that socialism is a lot like the villain in a low-budget horror movie, in the sense that in cheap horror films, the bad guy always gets up again. Every time you think they finally managed to kill him, he gets up again and is just as deadly, just as lethal as ever before, and stubbornly refuses to die. Socialism is a lot like that. It used to be a common assumption that the history of socialism, as I said, ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, of socialist Czechoslovakia, and so forth. But no, it wasn't. Actually, just over a decade later, we saw another socialist experiment unfolding in Venezuela this time. And more recently, we've then seen the collapse of that experiment as well, which was also hugely fashionable in Western countries for a while. We've seen that collapsing in real time. You could be forgiven for thinking, okay, surely this is it. Surely now the penny has to drop. How many times do we have to go through this? But no, just as the experiment in Venezuela was collapsing, actually socialism experienced a rebirth, a rebound in a lot of Western countries, Britain and America among them, and specifically among the young. That's where the term Millennial Socialism comes from. We can see this in a couple of surveys. This is not just a media frenzy, not just a media bubble phenomenon. We can see this in the data, well, and also in lots of presentations. The Economist, about a year ago, had an entire edition on this subject, Millennial Socialism, and the New Statesman and the New York Times were using that phrase as well. As you would expect, these magazines differed in their evaluation of the phenomenon. The Economist was mostly critical of it, skeptical. The New Statesman, left-wing magazine, was very much in favor. The New York Times was somewhere in between. But they all agreed on one thing, which is that it is happening, and it isn't just a social media bubble phenomenon. And we can really see this in the survey data. This is from a survey that was done in Britain about 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, where people were asked whether they agree with this statement here. Communism could have worked if it had been better executed. And what you see here is the share of respondents who agree with this. This would be the green bar. By age group, what you see is, and the precise numbers don't matter so much, but the short summary is, among millennials, among people under the age of 35 roughly, about 40%, almost 40% agree with this statement. And what is perhaps more interesting than that, or certainly worse than that, is that even among the other 60%, the ones who don't actively agree with this statement, most of them don't disagree either. They just choose a non-committal response. They say, I don't know, or I neither agree nor disagree, which means that once you filter out those who don't express an opinion, you've got a clear majority among those who do have an opinion agreeing with the statement, especially here among people aged 25 to 34. That would be the people who agree with it outnumbering those who disagree in a ratio of 2 to 1. So a clear relative majority do agree with this statement. It's only when you go further up, but even among people in their late 30s, early 40s, it's still just over 30% who agree with the statement. So it's not just the very young. That's what makes millennial socialism special. And here a similar survey from, in this case, 4 years ago, where people were asked what about their opinion on socialism, favorable, unfavorable, neither. And once again, this is done by age group. We can see around 40% among younger people, and young broadly defined, meaning up to the age of 50. Around 40% agree or have a favorable view of this, and among the others, most don't actively disagree, they just don't have a view on it, or say, I don't know. So among those who do have a view on socialism, the ones who are in favor, the ones who have a positive view of it, outnumber those who have a negative view of it in a 2-to-1 ratio once again. Now this is, again, this is once you go up to higher age groups, this looks a bit different among people in their 50s, early 60s. There, the critics and the proponents of socialism roughly balance each other out. But then again, it isn't just the very young, and maybe that's what makes this different from earlier periods. It would always have been that's the case, probably, that very young people, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, would go through a socialist phase. But here we're talking about people in their 30s and 40s even, so this isn't just a matter of teenagers. This now goes much further up the age distribution. This is Britain. In America, it looks pretty similar. This is the percentage who have a favorable view of various isms. And again, this is by generation. Generation Z, Millennials, Generation X, and Baby Boomers. And we can see significant numbers having a positive view of socialism. Among Millennials, about 50%, half of them. Now you could say, well, in America, maybe they use the term socialism in a confused way. Maybe some of them think about Nordic type, Scandinavian type social democracy. They just use the term socialism wrongly. Okay, that's true for some, but you can see here if you ask about communism or Marxism, that is a good way to control for that if you phrase it in that way. If you ask, do you have a favorable view of communism? Do you have a favorable view of Marxism? Yes, it drops, but we're still talking about more than 1 in 3. So it is not just explained by people misunderstanding the term. Some do, but a substantial minority actually do have a favorable view and define it correctly. Those are the ones who would use these 3 terms more or less interchangeably. And we are still talking about more than 1 in 3 people, which is again a relative majority if you bear in mind many will just say, I don't know, or I have no opinion on this. Similarly, also in the United States, this is the percentage of respondents who say they would vote or are likely to vote for a political candidate who self-identifies as a socialist. Among millennials, 70% say, yes, I would. And Generation Z, slightly behind, but this could be because there's more who don't have an opinion yet. You have to go further up the age scale, the age distribution, until you find people where a majority doesn't hold that view. Now, before we talk about why this could be, it makes sense to briefly go into a definition. What are we actually talking about? I'll come back to that in a minute. What is socialism actually? The easiest thing in a case like that would be to just go by the dictionary. Whatever the dictionary says, that's socialism, and that would be the easiest way forward. The dictionary is very clear. Socialism means collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution. So that's easy enough. That's a fairly straightforward definition. If you apply this definition, it's perfectly clear that, for example, the former Soviet Union would have been socialist. It ticks those boxes. The former Czechoslovak Socialist Republic would absolutely have been an example of socialism. North Korea today would be socialist. Cuba today would be socialist. And China in Mao Zedong would definitely have been socialist. And it's also clear, if you apply this definition, that Sweden, Denmark would absolutely not be socialist. Those are clearly market economies. They don't have governmental ownership of the means of production. So that would be the easiest way to do this. However, in practice, we don't always use words in the way that is technically correct. In practice, at least in English-speaking countries, there are people who use the word socialism but actually just mean something milder, social democracy, Swedish style, something like that. Whether that's correct or not, that is what some people do. However, in this book, I stick to the dictionary definition because I think this is fair, because at least the people who are more vocal about it, the more vocal, more articulate members of this millennial socialist movement, if you want to call it a movement, they are absolutely clear about what they mean, and they don't mean Sweden or Denmark. I'll show you just two examples here. This is a quote from somebody who was the vice chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America. So this would be this political group that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are from, the DSA. In his book, he says, social democracy left capital structurally dominant. Capitalists were able to hold democratic governments hostage. Social democracy is a step in the right direction then, but ultimately not enough. So this shows you, at least the people who are more outspoken and more articulate about this are perfectly clear what they mean by socialism, and he certainly does not mean social democracy. And he's very clear about it and defines socialism specifically in opposition to that. And here's a British journalist making a similar point. She also says, today the radical left is calling not for social democracy, but for democratic socialism, and then also clear about the difference. The former means the taxation and regulation of private enterprise, while the latter means the democratic ownership of most large corporations and financial institutions. So these people, these are the most vociferous members of this millennial socialist movement. They definitely don't have Scandinavian-style social democracy in mind, and they are absolutely clear about this. And therefore, I think it's absolutely fair to use socialism in the original sense, because they do it too. So why should I use it in a different way from them? I mean, if anyone has the right to define what socialism is, truly it's its own proponents, and they are perfectly clear about this. Now this leads us to an obvious question, which is, how can an idea that has been tried so many times still be so popular? And socialism has really been tried to the point of destruction. There have been more than 24 attempts in this very place, of course, but also all over Central and Eastern Europe, large parts of Asia, China, Vietnam, parts of Africa, Angola, Mozambique, you name it, Cuba, parts of Latin America. No shortage really of attempts to build socialist societies in very different circumstances, very different ways, very different types of socialism. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter how they start, where they're starting from, and how exactly they implement it, always ends in failure. So how can such an idea still be so popular after so many attempts? And a big part of the answer has to be that socialists have been very good at distancing themselves from the real-world examples of their ideas in action. They have been good in disowning those failures and claiming, no, that wasn't socialism. That's not what we want. We want something completely different. Here are 3 examples of that. Noam Chomsky, of course, perhaps the most famous left-wing intellectual in the world, said there hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Here's Owen Jones, British journalist, who said the socialist society doesn't exist yet. And Aaron Bastani, who's the author of a book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism, he says, while it is true that a number of political projects have labeled themselves communist, the aspiration was not accurate. So these are all different ways of saying it has never existed. It hasn't been tried. There were just societies that called themselves socialist, but never were. Mislabeling is intellectual fraud. That is the argument. There's many problems with that argument. The most blatant problem with it, and that's the one that I go through in the book more than any other, is that if you look at the history of this claim that previous examples of socialist societies were somehow not really socialist, if you look at the history of this claim, what you'll find is that socialist intellectuals usually only make that case after the event, in hindsight. Once example of socialism, a socialist experiment, has already been widely discredited. Once it's either collapsed or it's widely seen to be a failure when it's clear that if you're a socialist and you are associated with this particular example, you have a PR problem. That is the point when Western intellectuals distance themselves from those examples and claim that it was never socialist. But as long as a socialist regime, a socialist experiment is in its prime, as long as it seems to have some success, you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone who claims that that is somehow not really socialist. Socialist experiments have often had initial periods during which they seem to work, during which they seem to have some initial success. And during those periods, Western socialists were usually very enthusiastic about that. There have always been periods of, well, what I call the honeymoon period of socialist regimes in the past, of regimes that had some initial success. And during those periods, you can always see lots of Western intellectuals praising them and endorsing them, claiming them as theirs, because that's the point when they want to take the credit for the alleged or actual success of those regimes. That's where they want to claim, yes, this is an example of our ideas in action, and yes, it does work and it's brilliant. And this has been going on for about a century, about 100 years. I'll go through a couple of historical examples. It started, of course, with the Soviet Union, the first large-scale example, the first large-scale experiment of socialist society. Nowadays, if you mention the Soviet Union in the presence of a socialist, that would be considered a cheap shot. They would say that's a straw man, you're being disingenuous here, or you just don't understand socialism, otherwise you wouldn't even bring this up. But that's what socialists say. Now that's very easy to say because the Soviet Union obviously is no more. But there was a time when this was very different. In the 1930s in particular, lots of Western intellectuals were very strongly in favor of the Soviet Union. It was once absolutely common to praise the Soviet regime and to hold that up as an example of socialism in action. I'll show you a few examples of that. This is a quote from the Webbs. These were two major British intellectuals at the time. They were co-founders of the New Statesman magazine and the LSE. They said in one of their books or papers on the Soviet Union, they said, "We may perhaps sum up the constitution of the USSR by emphasizing its reliance on the widest possible participation of the whole adult population in the public business, which includes the planned control of the whole social environment. Power actually does emanate from the people." This isn't some cherry-picked quote. This is fairly typical. This is a typical statement from that period, 1930s. Typical in the sense that you often get this claim that the Soviet Union, even though it looks like a dictatorship from the outside, it is actually a worker-run, a peasant-run democracy. It is actually like a very large working men's club. It is the workers getting together in their factories and deciding what they want to produce. And it is run in that way, like a local football association or whatever, and the whole country and the whole economy is run and planned in that way. And there's lots of statements from that period that you can find. Here's an American writer, for example, who said at the time, after a trip to the Soviet Union, everyone acted as though the general good was his personal good. In America, the worker had no real voice in the management of the national economy. Here, meaning here in the Soviet Union, the average man felt himself master of everything. So this is once again this sentiment, this is the worker-run economy. The workers are running their economy. They are in control. This is the real thing. This is socialism as it's supposed to be. And there's plenty of examples of that kind. Here's a similar one. This is an English writer from the time who said, "For the first time in history, the common man feels that the country belongs to him and not the privileged class that are his masters. The Marxian ideal of a classless society has been realized." So that was the perception of the Soviet Union among mainstream intellectuals. I mean, these are not fringe figures. These were well-established, respected intellectuals in their time, and that was the way a lot of them described it. Similar one here, an American philosopher who said those workers up there, carelessly dressed, coatless and collarless. This was after he visited a Soviet factory. and describes it. He says, those workers and men like them are running the new Russia. So again, the same sentiment, the worker-run democracy, that's what the Soviet Union is. And you even have people idolizing the gulags and the Soviet prison system. Here's an American author who visited a prison camp and said they were talking and laughing as they were evidently enjoying themselves. It was difficult to believe that this was indeed a prison. So even the most atrocious aspects of the Soviet regime, even that was, even there they were putting a positive spin on that. Similarly here from George Bernard Shaw, who is still a famous playwright, still in theatres nowadays. So in England, a delinquent enters prison as an ordinary man and comes out a criminal type, whereas in Russia, he enters as a criminal type and would come out an ordinary man, but for the difficulty of inducing him to come out at all. So this last sentence here, interesting, he says, the main problem that the gulags have is that people don't want to leave again, because it's so much fun to be at a gulag. And I mean, you can find hundreds and thousands of examples of that. This isn't even the biggest collection of quotes, but you could go on forever with this. But let's leave it there, you get the point. What happened is that, the short summary is that in the 1930s, it was absolutely mainstream among Western intellectuals to idolize the Soviet Union. And it was only with the beginning of the Cold War and the Soviet Union becoming the enemy that was falling out of fashion. And the former supporters of the Soviet Union then just fell silent on it. But what's interesting about that period is this falling out of love period was that there wasn't much of a reckoning. There weren't many people who said, yes, I was wrong. I was fooling myself, or I was fooled by Soviet propaganda. There wasn't much of that kind. It did happen. There was a book in the 50s, I think, which was called The God That Failed, which was about a couple of former admirers of Stalin who then admitted, yes, I was wrong, and who described that process. But they were very much the exception. Most of the others just fell silent on it. And then you had a new generation of socialists growing up who didn't have this attachment. And for them, the Soviet Union meant nothing. For them, this was just a perverted version of socialism, something that had nothing to do with the real thing. And that's how, in hindsight, in retrospect, Soviet socialism became not real socialism. But it definitely was to a lot of Western socialists at the time. But then, a generation later, the same thing happened again, in the 60s, early 70s. It's just that at that period, there were a couple of different utopias. There was North Vietnam, of course. That was very popular, the student movement at the time, and so was Cuba. And above all, Maoist China. That was the main utopia of the day. And we can once again see lots of praising statements here from mainstream Western intellectuals. Here's an American historian who said the people seem healthy, well-fed, articulate about their role as citizens of Chairman Mao's New China. The Maoist revolution is on the whole the best thing that happened to the Chinese people in centuries. So this was in the, I think, 60s, so just after Chinese socialism had caused the biggest famine ever in human history, and they had their own version of gulags, perhaps at the time the most atrocious regime in the world, and you still had those kinds of statements here from mainstream Western intellectuals. Here's an American scientist who said, they, meaning Chinese workers, are not free to change residence or job, but in spite of that, the Chinese masses seem to enjoy a greater measure of control over those agencies that directly affect their daily lives than most Western city workers. So this is a similar sentiment as you've seen in the pro-Stalin, pro-Soviet Union quotes, this idea that this is an economy which is collectively run, democratically run, the working man, the peasant is in charge. They are running this like a large club. They have control over their lives in that way, even if they lack individual freedom. Doesn't matter, they don't need individual freedom, they have collective freedom. They can plan things collectively, and it doesn't matter that they have less freedom in their role as individuals. And similarly here, this was an American psychologist at the time who also said, the certainty of success dominates the Chinese mood today. Their accomplishments assume dreamlike proportions in the cold light of an American day. they virtually have eliminated many social problems. So this is again this sentiment that they're building a superior society. They may not be rich in the Western sense, but they're eliminating social problems, alienation, so on. And you can also see this here. An Italian journalist who later became an MEP, saying there is no trace of alienation in China, nor of those neuroses or that inner disintegration of the individual found in the parts of the world dominated by consumerism. The Chinese world is compact, integrated, an absolute whole. So very much romanticizing, idolizing that system from abroad and from afar. Again, the repressive character was somewhat acknowledged, but many just glossed over that or rationalized it away. Here's a British historian who said the regime is authoritarian only towards a minority who are not workers or peasants. China's successes are being achieved by the voluntary and even enthusiastic effort of most of the people. So once again, the sentiment, it may look like a dictatorship to us Westerners, but no, make no mistake, this is a proper peasants' democracy. The peasants are running their society democratically, and it's all wonderful. Now, yeah, I could go on, but you get the idea. It was once again, you had lots of people praising this regime. It was only then, after the death of Mao, that mainstream intellectuals fell silent on that subject once again, and Maoism became a bit of a joke. I mean, this is from a British TV series from I think the late 70s, where they were making fun of this stereotypical Maoist student figure. It became an object of ridicule. It became something that you make fun of because of their sectarian character, of this tendency that Maoist groups have to split over minute theoretical differences. It became something that you would associate with comedy, a bit of a joke, but that was only because the mainstream intellectuals had moved on to other causes. And what happens when all the mainstream intellectuals move on? Well, you're only left with a certain subset, which are the weirdos and the cranks, and that's why it became a bit of a joke. But that in the 60s and in the early 70s, while Mao was still alive, Maoism was absolutely a mainstream pursuit, and it was those who went to any Western university in the 60s will know this. They would have seen people waving Chairman Mao's little red book and all that, and the same, of course, with North Vietnam. So those were the utopias of the day. Those were the big examples. You then also had a couple of more niche examples. North Korea was one of them. North Korea was never a place that attracted mass pilgrimages in the way which the Soviets and China did. It was never widely idolized, but still it had its supporters in the Western world, because it wasn't always, for us today, it is of course completely obvious that South Korea is an infinitely better type of society than North Korea, but that wasn't always so clear. In the 60s and 70s, North and South Korea were roughly similar levels of development, and South Korea was a dictatorship as well, so it wasn't, the jury was still out, it wasn't so clear which of these societies would turn out to be the more attractive one. And while that was not clear yet, you had, once again, some Western intellectuals siding with the North Korean regime and praising that as an example of actual socialism. Here, for example, is Joan Robinson, who was one of the leading British economists at the time in the 60s, one of the founders of the so-called Cambridge School. She said, all the economic miracles of the post-war world are put in shade by these achievements, meaning the achievements of North Korea. The outward signs of a cult are very marked, but Prime Minister Kim Il-sung seems to function as a messiah rather than a dictator. So this is once again the idea that this is actually a democracy. It just doesn't look that way. Yes, they have all these statues of Kim Il-sung around, but that's just a symbolic. He's just a symbolic figure. It's actually the ordinary workers who are in charge of this. Here's Eldridge Cleaver, who was a fairly famous American politician at the time. He was a presidential candidate for, I think, the Black Panther Party. I grew out of the civil rights movement. That was the Socialist a militant wing of that. He said, here in Korea, we have found people who have laid the foundations of communism and who are now rushing to transform their society into an earthly paradise. We will tell the American people of the glorious victories of socialist revolution. So this doesn't sound like somebody who thinks that that isn't really socialism. At that time, it was fairly normal, even if not among huge numbers of people, to idolize North Korean socialism. This is an American historian who also said that this is a decent society in which equality of goods, services, and opportunities prevails. Everyone enjoys a certain richness of life. A society which is democratic in the ultimate meaning of the word, economic and social democracy, which can only emanate from the end of class rule. So you can once again see the idea here that even though it may look like dictatorship, this is actually, in a different sense, a more democratic society than what we have in the West, because it's not a class-based society. It's a society where the working class is supposedly in charge. You have once again this romantic idea of the working men's club, and well, could go on, but I don't want to bore you. That was North Korea at the time. Then you even had Cambodia, perhaps the most, and there was a Khmer Rouge, perhaps the most atrocious regime, where you would think surely nobody can defend that. Well, even there some did. Again, this wasn't very widespread. That's because it was a small country and most people weren't aware of what was happening there at the time. But among those who, among scholars who paid attention to that part of the world, it was fairly common to see the Khmer Rouge as a kind of, their regime as a sort of romantic, agrarian type of socialism. This is, for example, a Swedish author who visited the place at the time, did a tour in the late 70s. He said these people, the people rose, freed themselves, threw out the intruders, and began to clear up the mess. Then crocodile tears poured forth in the West. The brothel has been emptied and the cleanup is in progress. Only pimps can regret what is happening. So during the Cambodian genocide, clearly siding with the regime and saying this is not a dictatorship, this is the people. The people are in charge here. Again, the working man's democracy idea. And this is another Swedish author who makes a similar case. He said, city dwellers who once lived in villas with servants do find the food a bit meager, but the cooperative guarantees food for all. The new society turns the dreams of a poor peasant into reality. So once again, the peasants' democracy idea here. This is actually this is a little utopia in the making. And this is another Swedish activist. This was especially popular in the Nordic countries for some reason. He said, we have learned already about all these achievements, but it was even more illuminating to see them with our own eyes. This is after a visit, that's what he means seeing it with his own eyes. The people who rely on their own strength and means can score wonderful feats. And this wasn't just these relatively unknown figures. Even someone like Noam Chomsky, even then, one of the most well-known intellectuals in the Western world, even he wrote about it. Analysis by highly qualified specialists who have studied the full range of evidence available concluded that executions have numbered at most in the thousands. So this is clearly genocide denial. This was the Khmer Rouge were killing about up to a quarter of the population, one of the worst genocides in history, at least in relative terms, compared to the population size. He clearly denies that, saying at most a few thousand, and says that these reports also emphasized repeated discoveries that massacre reports were false. So he clearly sides with the genocide deniers, saying this is all fake, this is fake news, this is all a hoax. This is the Western media wants you to believe that this is a bad regime, but actually it's all made up, don't believe it. And well, I could go on again, I don't want to bore you, you get the idea. Someone saying only the most serious criminals were executed, and I could go on. And this was the 70s, then in the 80s you have also a couple of examples. It was Nicaragua, there were a couple of places in Africa, Angola, even Mozambique for a short time. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, we had a bit of a break. after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the regimes of the Eastern Bloc, there was, for about 15 years, there was no major socialist example that Western socialists would hold up. So this is the only period I could identify for the book in which there was no major example that Western socialists would point to and idolize. For about 15 years there was nothing. And this then changed in the mid-2000s, around 2005, with Venezuela suddenly becoming the next utopia, the utopia of the day. What happened then was Chavez became president originally in 1999, so he had been president for a while already, but he was not particularly socialist in the beginning. He was a fairly standard mainstream populist. He did not have a well-developed socialist worldview initially. This changed in the early 2000s, and then around 2005 he started using a particular phrase, which was socialism of the 21st century, and that was sort of the starting, the starting shot, the firing shot for Venezuela mania in the West. And once they had this expression, you had suddenly again the idea that this is socialism, but it has nothing to do with these earlier attempts. So by just adding 21st century, that was all it took, to cleanse the term of its earlier association. Once they stuck in 21st century into and coined it as a phrase, suddenly you have permission again to be a socialist. I certainly remember this. I was an undergraduate student in East Berlin at the time, and in 2006, 2007, you could suddenly see Venezuela flags popping up everywhere, over campus and all over the university. And that was a new thing. Until then, I didn't even know what the Venezuelan flag looked like. Never thought about that country. Suddenly it was everywhere. And they invited speakers, and it was a massive hype. And you can show this in quotes once again. This is a British journalist, somebody who is still very socialist activist, still on TV pretty much every day. He wrote in, I think, 2012, Venezuela is an inspiration to the world. It really does show that there is an alternative. And elsewhere, he said, under Chavez, the poor have become a political power that cannot be ignored. He has proved it is possible to break with neoliberal dogma. So this is 8 years ago. And what's interesting about this statement, or both of these statements, is that he clearly sees Venezuela, the success that they seem to have at the time, as something that isn't just a success story in its own right. He sees this as a model that others should learn from. He sees this as a model that offers lessons to particularly the Western world. That's what this means here, this statement, prove it as possible to break with neoliberal dogma. What he means by that, of course, is that we should do this too. This isn't just something we should admire from far away, from the distance. We should actively learn from them and emulate their policies. Inspiration to the world, that's the same sentiment. And here's Seamus Milne, who was Jeremy Corbyn's main advisor during the last two elections. This was in 2012. He also traveled to Venezuela and said, Venezuela and its Latin American allies have demonstrated that it's no longer necessary to accept a failed economic model, as many social democrats in Europe still do. So this is once again, what you see here is also the sentiment that this isn't just a success story in its own right. This is something that we, in the West, should actively emulate. That's why he mentions social democrats in Europe. What he means by that here, of course, is mainstream social democratic parties, parties like the Labour Party, as it was then, or the German SPD. I don't know what the Slovak equivalent of that is, but whatever the mainstream centre-left party is, that's what he has in mind here, that these people should abandon their brand of social democracy, the kind of social democracy that makes its peace with the market economy. He says, no, absolutely unnecessary. We don't have to accept the market economy. Look at Venezuela, they show that you can do it differently. Here's Jeremy Corbyn himself saying, this is just after Chavez's death in 2013. He says, Chavez showed us that there is a different and a better way of doing things. It's called socialism. So remember that when somebody tells you that Venezuela isn't socialist, Corbyn himself said it is. And I mean, if he doesn't know what socialism is, then who does? Here, this is in 2015, just 5 years ago, he was still praising it. This is an article that he published on his website, which for some strange reason he has deleted in the meantime. But the internet never forgets. He said, Venezuela is seriously conquering poverty by emphatically rejecting neoliberal policies. As with Cuba, the threat to the USA by Venezuela is a threat by example of what social justice can achieve. So even in 2015, when the Venezuelan economy was already imploding, he genuinely thought that that Western governments, America especially, were afraid of this example, afraid that Western workers might look at Venezuela and think, wow, we want to live like that as well. And that's what he means here by threat of example. So this is until 2015, this was widespread. It was only then when Venezuela became an absolute embarrassment, and it was crystal clear, could no longer be denied that this was a massive failure, that socialists once again started to roll back and disown it. And you can see that by just contrasting what people said then and now. Here's Noam Chomsky, for example. He was one of the early Venezuela fans. He said in 2007, what's so exciting about Venezuela is that I can see how a better world is being created. The transformations that Venezuela is making towards the creation of another socioeconomic model could have a global impact. So this is 2007, Chomsky being clearly an admirer of Chavismo. And then, 10 years later, he suddenly changed tune and said, I never described Chavez's state capitalist government as socialist or even hinted at such an absurdity. It was quite remote from socialism. So quite the contrast here, what a difference 10 years can make, and an economic collapse in the meantime. And there's an even more extreme example, which is from John McDonnell, who was or still is, the shadow finance minister of Jeremy Corbyn. He's the one who would have been Britain's finance minister if they had won the election. In 2014, in a documentary, he said Chavez lit a spark that really started a fire brand. Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution became an item on the agenda for all socialists. Here you have the contrast between capitalism in crisis, talking about the financial crisis here in the West, and socialism in action. So the man himself called Venezuela socialism in action at the time. And then just 4 years later, he said, I don't think Venezuela is a socialist country. I don't think they have been following socialist policies. And as a result of that, they are experiencing problems. So they're in trouble because they're not socialist enough. That is the problem. So you can see this process here of praising and then retroactively disowning. In real time here, this is normally this takes a bit more time. Normally this happens over the course of a generation, this process. Now it's all compressed. Maybe it's because of the age of social media or whatever, but in principle this is not unrepresentative. It's the same pattern that you can see for all of these regimes. There's always a honeymoon period in the beginning in which Western intellectuals would widely praise it and flock to those places and trying to claim the credit for it and say, yes, this is socialism. This is the system we want. Wonderful, brilliant, this is the future. Then you get a period of confusion where it depends on the circumstances. It might either be that they just deny the atrocities. This was the genocide denial in Cambodia would be a good example here. Or try to divert attention, saying, yeah, there's some bad stuff happening in Venezuela, but look over there. Look what other regimes are doing, distracting, and that's what whataboutery means, as if some other bad example somehow made Venezuela this bad. And then, whatever form that takes, it always ends the same way, which is the third and final stage. That is the not real socialism stage, when Western intellectuals would claim that was never socialist, and it's a straw man, and you just don't understand socialism if you bring these examples up at all. Now, so much for Western intellectuals. A few words before we wrap it up on socialism itself. Let's have a look at why socialism was always such a failure. It was, of course, not a complete coincidence. It wasn't that it was just done in the wrong way. There are a number of systematic reasons for that. One of them is that you basically you cannot coordinate an economy without market prices. If you switch off market prices, it would be like traffic. If you get rid of all the traffic lights and the traffic signs and everybody's driving blindfolded, you have nothing that can coordinate that economy. You get chaos, and this is the case in fully planned economies where you have the state bureaucrats trying to set prices, which would just be arbitrary fantasy numbers, or in an economy like Venezuela where you have market prices in some areas, but you then have bureaucrats trying to temper with them through price controls. Can even happen in an otherwise market-based economy that you have price controls distorting market signals. Whichever it is, fully government-controlled prices are of course worse, but even if it's on a smaller scale, if you mess around with market prices, you get chaos. There is no way around that. Market prices are just an extremely efficient way of gathering information, because market prices are set by the behavior, the consumer behavior of millions of people. Every time we buy a coffee or check into a hotel or whatever it is that we do, we are sending signals to producers. We are showing, I like this product, please produce more of that, I'm prepared to pay for this. I don't like that product, please produce less of that. And that's how you coordinate a market economy. Even though we don't think about this, we just act and react to signals, and in that way create new information, send new signals. It's a system under which we send and receive signals, and the economy just steers itself. No socialist economy has ever found a way around that, found a way of replacing market signals. Another thing that socialist economies have been unable to replace or replicate is the trial and error function of competition. Well, that's what Hayek, and some of you are Hayekians, what Hayek called competition as a discovery process. What that means is that a market economy is a constant process of trial and error. You try lots of different business ideas, lots of different business models in competition with each other, and that is how we find out over time what works and what doesn't. We don't know from the outset how you organize a successful industry. We have to try different things, most of which will fail. Most businesses in a market economy fail. Most companies, over 50% of newly set up companies, fail within the first 5 years. And that is not because the people running them are incompetent or anything. It's because we know so little about what works. If that happens in a market economy where we have access to market prices and all this information, just imagine how much worse this must be if you try to organize an economy without this completely. If you just have a single 5-year plan imposed on the entire economy, if the planners get it wrong, then the entire economy suffers. And that's where the argument that socialists sometimes make that you just had incompetent planners, it was just the wrong people, where that argument falls down. Because it's not that socialist planners were particularly incompetent, that they were less clever than Western entrepreneurs. In fact, so some of them were very clever people. It's just that they operate in a system where if they get something wrong, the whole country suffers. Whereas if you run an individual company, or if you make managing decisions in an individual company and you get something badly wrong, it's just your company that suffers. The damage is much more limited. So that's why it's no good to say, well, Mao, he just had a stupid idea, the idea of creating mini factories in every village, pulling people out of agriculture. If he hadn't done that, they wouldn't have had the famine. Yeah, well, the problem is he was in a position where he could impose that mistake on the whole country. If Mao had been the manager of an individual company in a Western country, that company would have failed, and that would have been that. We would never have heard of the name Mao. It would just be some, maybe if you're a student of business history, it would be a case study for students, but otherwise we would never know about the man. It doesn't matter in a market economy if individual people fail. That can happen. That's a good thing, in fact. That's part of the process. That's how we learn. You have that in a market economy. You can't replace it in a planned, centrally directed economy. And thirdly, there is one of the strengths of a market economy is that if you're not happy with your arrangements, let's say your place of work, or your supermarket, or your bank, or your energy supplier, whatever it is, if you're not happy with some of your contractual arrangements, you have alternatives. You can do things differently, whereas in a planned economy, you have to somehow try to influence the bureaucracy, try to get them to change things. And that would be the case even if we had an example of a perfectly democratic socialist society. Even then, if you're not happy with something in a democratic socialist economy, you would have to persuade 50% of the population first before anything can change. You'd have to persuade 50% plus one, whereas in a market economy, you don't have to do that. You can just leave whatever arrangements you are happy with. And you don't have to know why that is. If some restaurant serves shoddy food, or if you think it's overpriced or bad in some other way, you don't have to know exactly why that is. You don't have to articulate a proposal how this could be improved. You don't need to know any of that. You can just not go there anymore, go somewhere else. It's a much more efficient process than this exit process is much more efficient than trying to change things from within, where you have to argue with everyone and people have to agree first and you have to work out what exactly the reason is for that failure. It's an extremely clumsy process, and in a market economy you don't need it. So this is so much for socialism in the economic sphere, and that's why we always see when we have quasi-controlled experiments like North Korea versus South Korea, or East Germany versus West Germany, where you always get such a massive gap in economic productivity and output. But it's more than that. It's if they had been poorer but more successful in other ways, then maybe you could make a case for saying maybe socialism is better in other ways. But it also leads to political tyranny, and that is not a coincidence either. It's just because once you have a centrally planned economy, well, then you have command and control. And even if that plan is somehow democratically drawn up, even if that's not possible, and Hayek says that it isn't, but even if it were, it would still be the case that even if you have an economic plan that is democratically approved, 50% of the population are in favor, it would still be the case that that plan then has to be enforced, and you can't allow people to then just move around freely and do whatever they like. One of the main reasons why the Berlin Wall was built was not that the people in charge were just psychopaths. It was that they realized you can't plan an economy when people move around all the time. You have to be able to allocate people, and that's why in the Soviet Union, well before the Berlin Wall was built, never mind that, in the Soviet Union, they introduced a system of internal passports and internal residence permits at the same time at which they rolled out the first 5-year plan. Not a coincidence. It just meant that now you have a planned economy, you have to be able to allocate the factors of production, and the main factor of production, of course, is labor, it's people. You have to be able, as a planner, to allocate people. You have to be able to tell someone, you go to this factory, you go to that factory, and you can't go elsewhere. You are allocated, and if you move around, you're messing up my plan, so stay where you are. That is not some aberration, that is the system, that is a feature of the system, it's in the DNA, and it is even logical within that system. It would be illogical to try to do that differently, and it wasn't for lack of trying. There are, in the history of existing socialist societies, you sometimes have this back and forth between centralization and decentralization. In the GDR in East Germany, there was a period in, I think, the late 60s or early 70s, where they tried to give more autonomy to local actors, to local state-owned enterprises, and they realized that you can't run a planned economy in this decentralized fashion, and they quickly had to re-centralize power. The reason is, decentralization makes sense if you have a system that is self-coordinating, a system of market prices and market incentives. There you can give people freedom to just do whatever they like. But if you don't have that, and you don't plan actively, you just get chaos. So it isn't that the people in charge are all just control freaks, it's that you have no choice. You have no other mechanism in a planned economy. You have to use command and control and force. So it isn't that you have just had the wrong people in charge, that you just had people forgetting about the noble ideals of socialism. No, they realized it's either that, it is either command and control, or economic collapse. That's why the Berlin Wall was built. The GDR at that point had lost about a fifth of the population, about 3 million people out of a population of initially 18 million. So you do the maths, if that goes on for a while, you can't run an economy in that way. So that they were not doing anything irrational. You have to close the exit option. That's why all socialist societies do that. And even if everything, even if you could do that in a perfectly democratic way, once you collectivize everything, you can no longer really have individual freedom, because everything you do now becomes everyone else's business. What I mean by that is, you just think about the socialized sectors that we already have. Britain, for example, has a socialized healthcare system. Healthcare is exclusively or almost exclusively provided by the state, and as a consequence of that, you now get nanny state arguments being justified in those terms. When people say, well, I want to drink alcohol, I want to smoke, that's my decision. If that's unhealthy, it's my problem, leave me alone. And people can then argue, no, it's not your business because I have to pay for it. So it isn't your business. I have a right to dictate your lifestyle because I'm ultimately liable. And that's a reasonable argument within that system. And in Britain, it's just a couple of sectors. It's the healthcare sector, which is like that. In a socialist economy, every sector is like that. So you cannot reasonably say, you do whatever you like. It doesn't matter. I mind my own business, you mind your own business. No, everything is everyone's business. There is no way around that. Therefore, the authoritarian character of socialism is not an accident. It is quite logical and even necessary within the socialist system. And this would be true even if it were perfectly democratic, but that in itself is of course not really possible. That's the point that Hayek made, that economic planning is just a process which means you have to handle colossal amounts of highly technical information. There is no way that you can get lots of people involved in this process. This is ultimately a specialist process. And it sounds nice in the abstract to say we will run this democratically, but in reality it will always involve delegation to technocrats, bureaucrats, decision makers. You can talk about, even with the scope that the government has today in Western democracies today, we can see limits of that already. For example, if you think about the Brexit vote, the big issue in British politics right now. During the actual referendum, it seemed like a mass democratic engagement, a mass democratic decision. You had turnout of more than 70% of the electorate, a lot more than in general elections. Lots of people got involved. Democratic in that sense, yes. But then ultimately, what happens after that, the actual trade negotiations about what that means in detail, that's not something that you can do with public participation. There, of course, you ultimately have a delegation of experts, a trade delegation that travels to Brussels, and they sort it out, and the wider public has no input in this. And this could not be otherwise, because they're dealing with highly technical aspects, such as rules of origin, what happens at the Irish border, do you have customs checks or not, how do they work? These are things that you can't sensibly have, can't expect widespread public participation. These are technical issues, and ultimately it has to be done by a technocratic body. And this is also true in nationalized sectors. We already have some sectors that are state-run, state-owned, such as, for example, in Britain we have the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is part state-owned, and nonetheless, if you ask people in the street, do you feel that you have an input? Do you feel that this is your bank, this is the people's bank? Most people would think you're mad. Of course, most people wouldn't even know that that bank is part state-owned, and to the extent that they do, they would think, no, it has nothing to do with me. This is a decision that this is run by politicians and bureaucrats. It has nothing to do with me. And if we can't even, if if nationalization doesn't mean democratizing things today with the limited scope of government that we have, why should that be any better to make the state even bigger? If we gave it an even wider remit, we can't make it work with the relatively small and relatively narrow scope of government activity that we have today. If you make it even bigger, you will make the problem worse, not better. There's no way you can have the masses of the population involved in management decisions of a state-owned bank or a state-owned railway company or a state-owned electricity company. It's never going to be that way, that you have loads of ordinary people turning up at the management meeting of a state-owned railway company. Of course, for most people this would be boring, dry, and they just want it to work somehow. That's perfectly reasonable. In short, socialism cannot work in the economic sphere. It has to lead to tyranny, and it cannot be done in a democratic way. So then, why does it not go away? Well, it's a couple of things. One of them is that socialism has a certain intuitive appeal. It makes sense on an intuitive, emotional basis. That's because we practice socialism on a small scale. In your own household, you don't have market transactions. In your own household, you do things collaboratively. So this naturally makes sense to us. It's just, of course, that if you try to run larger groups in that way, the cost and effort of coordinating that grows exponentially. You can still do that at the level of an Israeli kibbutz, where they have maybe 500 people in a cooperative mini society, and which would also be a mini economy, and with 500 people, the size of a very small village, they all know each other, they have a relatively simple economy, they would just do agriculture or just do one type of industry. There you can still make that work, but the cost of that type of decision making grows exponentially. You can't make it work on a bigger scale. Even the Israeli kibbutzim don't grow beyond a certain level. The biggest ones are at 1,000 people, so that seems to be the absolute upper limit. They never grow much beyond that size. So there's no way you can make a society of, like here, 5 million people operating that way, let alone in Britain with 65 million people. Absolutely unachievable, but it makes intuitive sense. We run things that way in our own small circles, in our private lives, and there's a part of us that wants to extrapolate, that wants to extrapolate from the way we do things in the household to the way we run the wider economy. That's the point that Hayek also made. He calls it the two worlds, the private world and the wider anonymous society, and we're just poorly adapted to that situation, because for most of human history, for hundreds of thousands of years, that distinction didn't exist. We lived in, our ancestors lived in small tribes, hunter-gatherers. You have maybe 50 people or so together there. That is your society, and that is also your extended family. That distinction between the private sphere and the larger society doesn't exist, and our minds are adapted to that environment. That was the theory, and this is why capitalism is just counterintuitive. The more mundane fact is that socialism is just fashionable. It's become quite hip to be a socialist, and that's maybe the big change compared to 5 or 6 years ago, when there have always been Marxist societies at Western universities. There were some at my university. They were considered slightly odd because they were using their internal jargon, and it all sounded a bit weird and off-putting. Whereas nowadays you have lots of hip people who use socialism more as a fashion statement, as a way of showing I'm one of the cool people, and it has caught on, and that's something that is very hard to argue against. You can't argue someone out of a position when they're mostly using it as a fashion statement. Then this is not a rational decision, and that means rational arguments will also fall flat. There's lots of rhetorical tricks that socialists would use. One of them is they would define the idea of real socialism by describing the type of society they want to see, by saying, oh, real socialism is a democratically run grassroots democracy, democratically run economy, a bottom-up type of economic planning. The workers get together, the workers run their economy collectively. Yeah, well, that's an outcome that socialists want to see. You cannot define socialism in that way. That would be as if I defined capitalism as an economy in which everyone is rich, and then every time you identify an actual society and find that, of course, not everyone is rich, if I said, oh no, that's not really capitalism, because I said, under capitalism everybody is rich, so if not everybody is rich, it's not really capitalism. I wouldn't get away with this, and I shouldn't, because that would be a cheap rhetorical trick, but socialists seemingly do get away with it. And last but not least, and I'll end with that, socialists have this habit of when something bad happens in a socialist society, they treat it as merely the wrong choice. You had a bad person in charge who made a bad choice. I mean, this is encapsulated, I would say, in a movie that some of you may know. The movie Goodbye Lenin came out, I think, 17 years ago. It's a movie that's set in East Berlin, and it's about, I'm not going to go into it, but the basic underlying message of that movie is that the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, just turned out that way because it was led by people who forgot about the ideals of socialism. They just need to be reminded. They somehow concentrated on the day-to-day business of running this economy. They somehow just forgot about the ideals that once motivated them. And if you just remind them, if you can just get the ghost of Marx visiting them overnight, then it would completely be turned around. That's what you could call the Goodbye Lenin fallacy. And but that is the way socialists, unfortunately, imagine how this works. And the problem is, for now, they seem to be getting away with it. I hope I'm trying to make a bit of a contribution to changing that, and I hope that you will too. Thank you.